Welcome to Mind Crime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are joined by Right Ruminations to discuss libertarianism, Christianity, and societal flourishing. Tim.
So the first question I have for Right Ruminations is, what does libertarianism get right? That's a sort of general overview of today's conversation. I find conservative criticisms of libertarians the most salient, which is why I'm ultimately interested in this style of criticism. I think Ed Feser is probably one of the better conservative critics of libertarians out there, and he's one of the people that might haunt the background of this episode. So in general, I'd say libertarians gets a few things correct: property, incentives, trade, and scarcity. I would say related to scarcity is the idea right out of Genesis of cursing the ground. Scarcity exists. We have diseases, we have to work, and so forth. There's not superabundance. Industrialization has brought the actual scarcity down significantly. I think that's one of the great things about the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism has brought the amount of scarcity down. We don't deal with certain things like infant mortality rate and all of these other things that used to hit medieval societies that don't really hit modern societies. So do you agree or disagree regarding this? Do libertarians get this right? Or do you have a different interpretation on scarcity?
I would broadly agree that libertarian strength lies in its observation about economics and about the mechanism of trade. I think that all of the best criticisms of libertarianism are broader political criticism. So, for example, if you have a problem with free trade, there really is little debating that if you were operating in a vacuum sociologically and you were just able to create an economy from scratch, you would want trade worldwide. That would be the most productive method. However, if you is that there are implicit regulations in nature, as it were, because other nations will invoke tariff power or they will in some way be introducing artificial regulations into the marketplace, then this is a kind of extrinsic political force which maybe libertarianism as an economic or a socio-economic model can't address. In this sense, I would say that all criticisms of libertarianism that I believe hold true are pragmatic criticisms. I believe that the basic mechanism outlined in libertarianism is sound, and I've never really seen any conservative who's able to adequately take it down, as it were. Even with very erudite traditionalist types, they often do seem very ignorant of economics or often not really knowing what the libertarians are really saying. This is my experience. I think that it really is a situation where any kind of systematic critique, libertarians have some kind of answer to it. In my experience, that's what they often do all day, is come up with explanations as to why these objections do not stand on their own merits. What I would say is that there are questions extrinsic to this mechanism of socioeconomic libertarianism, such as behaviors of other countries, or whether humans will actually ever tolerate libertarianism, politically viable, whether attempts to introduce, say, an anarcho-capitalist order will result in other forms of tyranny, is really the kind of critique of libertarianism that I have. So what I would say is that if libertarianism could exist, I see no reason why it couldn't work. My understanding is that libertarianism cannot exist as such, or is not politically viable, even if it is socioeconomically viable. And it's because they neglect this particular approach that I think conservatives often look foolish when they're trying to take down libertarianism. With respect to the second part of your question about scarcity, which I think is related to this topic of Christianity. I don't believe that there is, if one believes in evolution, for example, the idea of any kind of pre-scarcity existence doesn't really seem to be plausible. I think that there is also a sense in which there's a conservative or maybe a libertarian sort of narrative that we need freedom because the fall of man introduced scarcity or something of this nature. Perhaps I am biased in this regard, that I don't like that argument precisely because I would see individualism and a natural state of liberty as a kind of pre-fall orientation. That is, it's not just that is in some ways the ideal. And I think that more likely I would stand the issue on its head and say that rather it's because of our fallen disposition that we have to perhaps entertain the idea of the state as a kind of natural given in our current circumstances. So my view of the state as a necessity is on both counts extrinsic and pragmatic, but my view is that both in the ideal sense and in a theoretical sense, the basic of, say, Austrian economics have withstood all of the criticisms that I've heard leveled against it.
It would seem from the parable of the talents that inequality is not per se bad, because one of the guys gets a greater return, other than gets lower ones, and this seems to be non-problematic, at least per se. To what extent do you think that wealth inequality is a problem, and how do you think a libertarian society would fare with respect to wealth inequality? Would you see that as potentially one of the Achilles heels of a libertarian society, or do you think that the distribution of income or wealth and/or wealth in that society would be a generally sociologically enriching one?
I certainly don't any ethical objection to inequality or hierarchy or uneven distribution of goods as being antithetical to Christianity, nor do I see it as philosophically a difficulty. I think obviously I would share the view of someone like Murray Rothbard in talking about the church fathers, that it makes a good deal of difference how that inequality is brought about. Obviously, if it's brought about by means that one considers unjust, then I suppose that the inequality is unethical. If it is brought about by means that are just, then it is ethically indifferent. I would generally fall along those lines in terms of my opinion, though I would add that there is the case I've heard that wealth discrepancies do constitute a sociological barrier, in that, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out, that you do have low income people living in close proximity to high income people, that there is a kind of relative sense of envy that can arise. So perhaps pragmatically, for reasons extrinsic to Christianity, one might want to address the question of unequal wealth distribution, but I see it as having no immediate ethical objectionableness, precisely because, as we see with Christ saying the poor will always be with you, and as you point out, the parable of the talents, there isn't any clear, at least, a condemnation of inequality in Scripture. But I will also say that I am a dogmatic minimalist, in that, as a Roman Catholic, my point of view is that you have the hard and fast plumb line doctrines, and that anything else in Scripture or in tradition is up for interpretation. So I tend not to get very attached to this or that interpretation of this or that passage or papal encyclical or what have you. I tend to very much hold to a kind of dogmatic essentialism or minimalism. and has not been any. This has not necessitated any condemnation of inequality. I really see nothing wrong with it, and I see that any amount of inequality can really be the result of a just distribution mechanism. But as I said, whether that is something that is societally viable is really a question for sociologists and out of my depth. But I certainly have no ethical objection to it.
So, Right Ruminations. One of the common criticisms that get wielded at libertarianism is the inequality, and this especially comes from Christian circles. Of course, it comes from the Christian left, but it also, to a certain times, comes from the Christian right as well. In general, I agree with the sort of Randian Yaron Brooks idea that most inequality, my impulse when I see inequality is generally that it's just enough, just as an idea of justice. It's just enough. It's worth pointing out, U.S. is the richest society out there per capita, maybe not precisely per capita, probably some of the Gulf states. But in general, it's worth pointing out U.S. working hours are like 10 to 20% higher than France and Germany. So no wonder why the United States is wealthier. That's a simple back of the envelope calculation you could do. I don't really buy the sort of Marxist version of history that the reason the West is wealthy is because of exploitation or slavery. I think it's mostly wealthy for internal reasons. Do you agree with this interpretation, or do you think there are certain extent unjust? Now, I'm well aware there's crony capitalism out there, but even in spite of all the crony capitalism, we see here in the United States in general, at least maybe not recently, but through much of the history, lots of people got ahead, pulled themselves out their bootstraps and so forth. I mean, even the ex-slaves, the bleeding heart libertarians will point out, do considerably well in the United States. So do you agree or disagree about the sort of apparent state of inequality?
I broadly agree. I like the term just enough. I'm a very just enough kind of person. I think that there will always be certain ethical wrinkles in any kind of social arrangement, but you have to sort of fish for an approximation of what seems the most elegant in terms of trying to approximate some sort of fairness. It brings to mind the nationalist writer Greg Johnson talking about how he is, on the one hand, a nationalist for these different types of peoples, but on the other hand, he's also realizes that if, say, pioneers arrived in America half a millennia ago, then it's not really feasible to say, well, after this nation of America has built, that it's going to be given back to indigenous Americas because an injustice in the distant past was committed. I mean, in that instance, there might be, just by virtue of possession of the continent of North America, depending on how these things were worked out in individual circumstances, there might be a kind of reliance on certain unjust acts in the past. But I think you have to deal with the trade-offs of how would you really plausibly deal with addressing those. So at a certain point, you have to sort of admit, like Hans Hermann Hoppe does, that yes, that if the state had never intervened or had never committed injustice, then obviously the distribution of ownership would look very different now. But you have to come up with some reasonable method by which to address that. So if you have an individual who wants to say, well, I have a specific claim that this specific person's ancestors took my specific land, then maybe he could file suit against them or something like that. But at a certain point, you just have to kind of let the cards fall, or the chips fall rather, where they will. I think that really these justice-based solutions are always approximative, which is one of the reasons that I'm not a real libertarian. I do believe that these aren't really a prioristic, purely deductive ethical conceptions, but they're kind of just looking at human realities and saying, all right, what is a reasonably elegant ethical solution by which we could address this distribution problem? And I think that the most reasonable ones do not pay too much attention to grievances of the past, especially between groups. The reason that I are not really things that can be taken on as serious issues is because in order for mass injustices of the past to be addressed, they'd have to presume some kind of group guilt. And once you've presumed group guilt, you've basically disturbed the process of the pursuit of justice by presuming members within that group to be guilty. So if you say that such and such is living on land that was taken from this group centuries ago, well, the question is, to what extent is that particular individual culpable in this reappropriation, and can you prove that that individual is not justly occupying that land? Since it's not feasible to prove that for every individual case, I think that any kind of redress for distant group wrongs is inevitably going to end up presupposing the guilt of individuals on collective association, which is in complete denial of the agency of free will and of individual culpability and so forth, and is therefore, to my thinking, antithetical to the sort of justice system that I would want. However, I would hasten to add that obviously this is, to an extent, ironing over certain injustices, but because I'm a just enough kind of person, I'm perfectly okay with that, because I don't claim to be operating on an a prioristic system, but on an approximative one.
Question number 3 regarding a libertarian society. Speaking of just enough, one of the important points about having property to me, and I like to point this out to my progressive or liberal Christian friends, because I think to a certain extent a society without property that just mainly consists of moral duties and like legislated laws, hate crime laws, welfare state, and I to a certain extent see sort of the nationalist right that's okay with socialism, and of course the secular left and the Christian left, to a certain extent meeting behind the moon, creating a sort of almost like a dystopia out there. One of the problems I have with the sort of when conservatives talk about moral duties is, to a large extent, one person's moral duty might not be another person's moral duty. And this can exist within Christian groups to a certain extent. So, to what extent does charity and, freedom of conscience for where good men of character can disagree is necessary? And to what extent is this only possible in a society that is broadly libertarian? Right? You go back, you attack the Catholic Church to a certain extent as a sort of Protestant. Say you disagree with some group, you might get, the Anabaptists were killed, the Lutherans were killed. Now, of course, the Lutherans went after Catholics as well. So they said, as Keith Preston would say, they set up their own theocracies. I totally agree. But we've been moving in this sort of classical liberal libertarian direction. To what extent do you think that is necessary for a flourishing society?
Well, it depends on how you define a flourishing society. I would say that you need a certain dose of individualism, as well as a number of other preconditions that are necessary individualism to provide for the kind of lifestyle that I would find satisfactory. In other words, one where one's charitable actions are a result of one's own free exercise of agency, where one is able to entertain divergent or heterodox opinions, where one has the leisure time to engage in contemplation, as Aristotle pointed out, that leisure is the basis of contemplation. And that this is sort of a axiomatic activity because it's the activity of the gods that he posits. So I do think that there's a precondition in this kind of classical liberal model for being able to, say, comfortably, publicly have the kind of conversation that we're having right here. I'm not entirely sure that even if the technology had existed, that we would be as overlooked or at our leisure in having this conversation if we were, say, living in ancient Egypt, for example. So I do think that is a lifestyle prerequisite that is found in individualism and in classical liberalism. To my mind, this is actually the strongest argument. Even though it doesn't demonstrate anything, it is empirically the best argument for individualism or of capitalism, precisely because it admits of one's first principles. It is very immediate about, this is the environment that I want to live in. These are the things that I actually hold dear in my whereas a flourishing society is kind of subjective. There's a matter of what is meant by flourishing. I mean, the Japanese, for example, many Northern Asians have what you might call a flourishing society, and this is due in large part to capitalism, but at the same time, it's not necessarily as individualistic or as enamored with heterodoxy as certain classical liberal conception that I might desire to see. So I do, if by flourishing society one means the type of society that I think we dissident types would actually find tolerable to live in, then it definitely presupposes a certain degree of individuality, which in turn presupposes a certain system that might broadly be in keeping with what you've called classical liberalism.
As a follow-up to that, I don't mean to necessarily go after the Catholic Church. It's worth pointing out that the Protestants have been just as theocratic, and you could argue that in some ways, depending on what you consider, Protestantism have been as theocratic as the Catholics. I'm perfectly fine with Tom Woods and perfectly fine with all sorts of, and most historical Catholic societies have a lot of similarities with a lot of historical Protestant societies. You see, the Church of England in the 1700s and 1600s. Maybe there's some differences. But to what extent does the Catholic Church follow historically the classical liberal idea, or possibly create it? I think that's what Tom Woods would argue to a certain extent. And to what extent does the Catholic Church, whether in practice or in theory, end up to undermine and not create this sort of order?
I think that the claims of libertarian Catholics about the basis of classical liberalism being in Catholicism is hugely exaggerated. I think that you definitely see a kind of advancement of a classical liberal society in northwestern Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries. I don't see that there is really borne out by history that there is this basis of classical liberalism in Catholicism. Now, there may be certain distant or tenuous links. Like, you do find that Thomas Aquinas probably did a good job of introducing this idea of investigative pursuit of truth, the idea that you state the opposite of what you believe. So even though he obviously, as a medieval Catholic, didn't believe in free speech the way you or I might believe in it, but he was sort of presaging, I suppose, an idea of free speech, or this idea of pursuing the truth through point and counterpoint, which did to an extent rationalize or serve to move towards a rationalization of Christendom. And so there are tenuous links like that. But then again, there are also even stronger links, you might say, with the Socratics, or with with certain elements of the ancient world, or with the ancient Germanic legal codes. So this idea that Catholicism has this sort of singular influence on classical liberalism, I find unconvincing and very overstated. And very often you find you get the hearing from some Catholic libertarians that if only Aquinas didn't believe in price fixing and usury laws, then he would be some kind of Rothbardian. I think that that's just purely preposterous. But I will say, though, that I don't see a clear link really between Protestantism as the basis of classical liberalism. Rather, I would say that what you're really looking at is a kind of ethnic distinction. What I would say is that you have a certain thinking in Anglo-Dutch sort of psychological constitution, some kind of inclination toward individualism or legalism or rebelliousness. And this is one of the things that Luther then appealed to and said, we are not with this Latin Catholic Church. We're free German nationals, or however he phrased it, that there was this sort of appeal to Anglo-Saxon freedom in the Protestant rhetoric. But it seems to me that this or the state toward legalism significantly predates Protestantism itself. So I'd say that rather than Protestantism causing Anglo-Saxon liberalism, it was probably a pre-existing motion toward Anglo-Saxon liberalism in the Anglo-Saxon mind that probably did more to beget Protestantism rather than the other way around.
R.R., when would you say that the individualist Anglo-Saxon societies arose, in the sense that you would describe them as somewhat individualistic? Because I think when I made reference to the pre-Norman societies in our debate, you, I think, at least implicitly treated them as slightly more collectivist societies, or at least societies in which there would be more sort of positive social obligations than you would get, say, in the 18th century, for example. So is your argument about individualism developing that it was within in a seedling form in the sort of peoples of Northwest Europe, in the sort of Germanic tribes, and then eventually sort of blossomed in, say, I don't know, the 18th century probably is the best date I can throw to that, or that they were individualistic earlier, and then there was sort of kind of rises and falls, and the 18th century just an example of a more predominant form, and then it kind of dissipated thereafter. So I'm just interested to see how you'd see that sort of chronologically speaking.
Well, I definitely don't think that the ancient Germanic tribes were individualistic compared to, say, anything that you'd find in the 20th century. No, I don't think that anyone at that time was really individualistic. Anyone, say, pre-18th century, or certainly not in any kind of primordial tribal arrangement. I would stand by what I said, that I have every reason to believe that these were highly collectivistic societies. I don't really view individualism as really belonging to the natural anthropology of mankind. I actually view individualism as a highly unnatural state, or a kind of transcendent state. And I think that it has to be very carefully nourished over time. I would say that rather there were certain seeds in legalistic understandings, or certain constitutional precedents, or in certain qualitative characteristics of the people that were moving in that direction with the establishment of the state, with the establishment of certain legal distinctions, and with certain movements toward independence from kind of broader European self-conceptualization. I wouldn't that they were in absolute terms individualistic. What I would say is I think that the same momentum that gave birth to liberalism also gave birth to Protestantism, but that it was not in any way approaching liberalism or individualism in its initial conception in anything that would seem so by today's standards.
What would you say then was the sort of driving force towards liberalism and individualism as such? You said there's a sort of seed forms, and you don't think it's Protestantism as such, because that's what I was going to take it, kind of the idea of Luther, the freedom of conscience. You said that's more of a sort of inheritance of the sort of Germanic peoples rather than a sort of seemingly individually sort of like a at least originally, sorry, a theological construct. So I was interested to see what you think, if it might not be able to be discernible. But what would you say was kind of like what would you think was the sort of major driving force behind moving from a sort of collectivist to a more individualistic society, say around, let's say the Reformation as a point at which the society becomes individualistic? You put a different date, but just for example, let's use that.
Well, I think it's a convergence of factors, and it's a matter of people getting away with what they think they can get away with given the conditions at any given time. So I've said that I think that there are basically three preconditions for an individualistic society. One seems to be a biologically, let's say biologically ethnic. That is, it tends to birth in largely Caucasian parts of the world, and that it also presupposes some degree of Greco-Roman philosophy, which of course the ancient Nords did not have, and it also, I think, presupposes some degree of Christian, or at least at one time Christian culture. So when you have the birth of the Renaissance and the reintroduction of classicism into the Western world, and you also the ascendance of Northwestern peoples in concert with that. So in Italy, for example, you have this Italian Renaissance, humanism, and all, except for Luther, as far as I know, all of the Reformation figures were humanists of one kind or another. And they were, I suppose, beneficiaries or actors in this convergence of certain biological realities together with the flourishing of certain philosophical movement, not least of which consisted of the reintroduction of various Neoplatonic and Aristotelian writings. And that also it takes off as technology and the printing press become available for the perpetuation of more heterodox opinions. So it's really a confusing to emergence of these three preconditions together with the opportunities provided by technology and the reintroduction or reinvigoration of Greco-Roman learning. If you wanted to look for some kind of silver bullet, the closest distinguishing factor of that era would probably be the surge in humanistic philosophical thinking.
No, that's plausible. Just quickly, what role do you think Christianity plays in the rise of liberalism or individualism?
Well, I think that the universalism of Christianity also what predisposes it to certain socialistic tendencies is also the thing that predisposes it towards liberalism, the idea that there is this sense in which every individual soul has value, that the truth will set you free, and even if it's not articulated in terms of a broader philosophy in the Bible, it is implicit in that you have these monks leaving their traditional aristocratic or hierarchical duties and going and fleeing into the desert. You have a statement such as there is no male and female, no Jew and Gentile, and so forth, that there is this understanding that some kind of rational understanding of self is meant to supplant traditional hierarchical or ethnic obligations. So in Christianity, there is this transcendent, universalistic element that is a necessary precondition for any kind of natural rights or any kind of systematic or socially neutral system of justice. I really don't see that as really being as prominent in other religions. I'm sure there are some analogs, but it really does seem something that's very articulate in Christianity. If you just look at the disciples, they are people who've basically dropped out of society, often from respectable positions, and have gone to follow this sort of bohemian cult. And I think that that in there is a sort of unfreezing of the tribal mind so that it can be receptive to more rationalistic or more honest appraisals of what sort of ethical system one should engage in.
Oh, yes, that's totally plausible. So moving on to a certain extent, what does Christianity lead? Does Christianity lead to an egalitarian view of man? You get this sort of idea. Protestants, some sects of Protestants are more explicit about this. Some are less explicit of this. It's just God, me, and the Bible. Maybe Christ, me, and the Bible. There's sort of this it evaporates of family ties, neither Greek nor Jew, neither male nor female. We'll get to that maybe in the second follow-up question. But there's also this sort of anti-family stuff that I was recently listening to the Cato Gottfried, and I, to a certain extent, would agree with Joseph Cato here that Christianity has anti-family things inside of it. You have to take up your cross and follow Christ. You must hate your mother, sister, father, home, and so forth. Now, again, this can get carried away, but this to me is very different than a simple sort of. Even the Greeks, they have these sort of ideals, but they were local to a time and place. To a certain extent, Christianity is universal. It's the only thing that you have. It's me, God, and the Bible. To what extent do you think Christianity has created this, and has this, which one I would say libertarianism and classical liberalism is one of the fruit of this. But what extent is this created this egalitarian view? Now, I am not totally opposed to egalitarianism at all. So to a certain extent, I'm in an uncomfortable position at times in these kind of debates. So you can take what you want from that question.
Well, I think that absolutely there is an egalitarianism inherent in Christianity. And like you, I don't view that as entirely a bad thing. I think that a certain egalitarianism is a precondition for really any kind of classical liberalism or any individualism. What I would say is that I think that man is naturally authoritarian. So when you're dealing with a society that's been endowed with a certain Christian egalitarianism, that when tyranny or collectivism, to use a more neutral term, does arise, when authoritarianism rises, it simply takes on the egalitarian framework of Christianity. But that's not really, in a sense, egalitarianism is sort of the victim in this situation, because authoritarianism will simply take on whatever the prejudicial dispositions of the society are, and that authoritarians are always looking for some excuse to exercise power. So in the context of Christianity, or of at one time Christian cultures, the collectivists or the authoritarians are going to take on Christian values, because that's what appeals to the psyche of a given people or with a given religious disposition. What I would say is that the authoritarian elements of egalitarianism are precisely where egalitarianism is least desirable, but I see those elements as basically being inherent in mankind. And I think that given that authoritarianism is basically guaranteed without Christianity, I think that it's well worth risking the possibility of authoritarianism that would happen to be egalitarian, if that's the risk you have to take in order for there even to be a possibility of having a society which is liberally egalitarian, which at least to some extent I support.
Well, I agree that enforced egalitarianism by far is when the authoritarian egalitarian is a kind of contradiction in terms. I would totally agree with that. But a lot of the more anarchist types, and I mean not necessarily all anarcho-syndicalists, but if you take the anarchists of Keith Preston or even the anarchists of Max Stirner, it ends up being, to me, to a large extent, functionally egalitarian. And to a certain extent, the Christianity that survives today is much more egalitarian than Christianity historically. And I see a lot of conservatives at times complain about this. And I'm to a certain extent curious where you fall in this sort of debate here regarding egalitarianism. We have seen a large amount. In some ways, there's less authorities today than there was historically in a medieval society. Now, there are ways in which we have informal authorities that might be even more perverse. Maybe the public schools, maybe the media. But there is a general mass distrust of the media, even amongst the left as well. So it's not entirely that. And even Chomsky is suspicious of the public schools as well. Now, I view moving toward lots of egalitarian as mainly a win. And even many people on the left would argue that the Soviet Union was a reactionary society, especially after like 1935. It just, they froze the family, they froze all these things, and they'd argue that Western Europe was the more radical socialist society. But to what extent do you fall in this sort of debate on egalitarianism? Is the move toward more egalitarian, is that fulfilling Christ's mandate or the Catholic Church's mandate, or is this in some way antagonistic to the goals in Christianity?
Well, as far as it goes, it's a move in what I would consider a desirable direction. Now, I should clarify that not egalitarianism if what you mean is that therefore one has to support, say, homosexual marriage, or one has to support open borders, or one has to support any kind of equality of religions, for example. Obviously, I reject that kind of egalitarianism in its entirety. However, that is egalitarianism as meaning trying to treat people within at least a sort of hypothetical social contract with some degree of fairness or blindness or of some sort of systematic integrity, I think is as a good thing. And I would also say that it is really, to reinforce what you've said about the Soviet Union having certain reactionary elements, what I would say is that I am anti-egalitarian in the sense that egalitarianism happens to be the idol that society currently worships. That is currently the sort of Pelagian or the self-willed, or that is the thing that is taking the place of God, is egalitarianism. Now, in another society, it could be something completely different. In some societies, it could be race. In some societies, it could be a certain form of theocracy that has various external interests or vested interests that is masquerading as a genuine religion. That is, there's always a certain orthodoxy in society that makes it socially requisite to deny certain self-evidently true things. So, for example, in medieval society, you'd basically be obligated to pretend that somehow the Bible was a pro-monarchical document. In today's society, you're obligated to believe that race doesn't exist. In the kind of American Revolution or early America, maybe you'd be obligated to think that there was like an eternal British Constitution that went back to Beowulf or something. In other words, there are always these sort of mythologies that I would say are idols. And that today, the reason egalitarianism looks so ugly is because it is the current idol that is taken the place of God in society. But that's not really saying that anything that egalitarianism is necessarily uniquely evil. Obviously, if taken to an extreme, it is. But rather that it is that it is idolatry itself and ideology in a certain sense itself, which is especially cumbersome, and that since that space happens to be occupied by egalitarianism, it's that sense in which I'm anti-egalitarianism, not necessarily in saying that all things considered that egalitarianism was necessarily the wrong move historically speaking.
And just quickly to follow up, do you think libertarianism is egalitarian internally? I tend to think that in certain ways libertarianism is the most egalitarian philosophy out there, in the sense that it just says everyone has a certain prescribed sets of rights, and that's the more a prieristic ones, of course. And more pragmatically, this has been the case that, as long as you're in the accepted in-group to a certain extent in Anglo-Protestant societies, you've been afforded rights as long as you can exercise them with the reason, your certain ability, and so forth. So I would say in that way. But libertarians also leads to some of the most inegalitarian ways, and this is where you can see these sort of left syndicalists and, of course, the Marxists would say, well, it leads to these great disparities of wealth. And this sort of circles back to my first question I asked. I would say those disparities of wealth. When I look at Elon Musk, okay, sure, there's plenty of corporate cronyism and so forth. When I look at Steve Jobs, I think there are transformative people out there that worked harder or had ingenious ideas. Of course, there's property, intellectual property, and all these other things that you could go on. But I would still say in almost any society, someone like an Elon Musk, someone like Steve Jobs, these sort of Randian type archetypes would be on top. And I think one of the big problems of socialist societies, and I'd say Christian left, Christian conservatives, yes, less so, but definitely the Christian left, and definitely left, suppress these kind of impulses. I'm glad there's great men in history, and great men in history. What do you agree with that? I mean, I say egalitarianism win, but is libertarianism egalitarian, or is it the kind of just inequality out there is that the kind we're looking for?
Well, obviously, libertarianism is egalitarian in terms of its first principles, in that it is legalistically egalitarian. Now, whether or not it is egalitarian in terms of its outcome is a question of which libertarian you're dealing with. I mean, if you're dealing with someone like Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is clearly inegalitarian, at least compared to probably the majority of libertarians. If you're dealing with someone who is on the far left of the libertarian spectrum, well, they're also inegalitarian in terms of outcomes, precisely because they want the social preference given to these various preferred victim groups. But if you're dealing with someone like Tom Woods or Lou Rockwell, I think that it would seem that if you really listen to them, that the kind of outcomes that they're looking for are probably fairly socially egalitarian in terms of allowing for a certain live and let live ethos in society, providing that one is working within the bounds of reasonable decency. I think that that really it is a matter of libertarianism as being fairly indifferent to ends. I think that the means of libertarianism are definitely egalitarian. The outcomes can be as egalitarian or inegalitarian as whatever individual libertarian that you are dealing with. So as an outsider, as a non-libertarian, sociologically, I'd have to sort of identify libertarianism with sin libertarianism, in that that is the basic theory. That's what a libertarian is. It's somebody who identifies with that, and any kind of outcomes in addition to that framework are kind of beside the point. So I would say that libertarianism as such is egalitarian, though one can have certain other inegalitarian desires and still libertarian. However, just to answer the second thing that you had said about people like Elon Musk as being on top in a libertarian society and having these inequalities of wealth distribution, well, I mean, in absolute terms, that's inegalitarian. But the question is, inegalitarian compared to what? I mean, if Elon Musk murders you on the street, there's probably a better chance than not that he's going to end up going to jail. I would imagine much more so than if, say, an Athenian ruler or an ancient Grecian ruler killed a slave. I would imagine that their chances of being subjected to just legal repercussions would probably be much slimmer than Musk's. So I'd say that you have to kind of compare. I mean, granted that inequality is everywhere and is natural, I mean, you have to kind of compare egalitarianism as compared to what? And I think that relatively speaking, the outcomes of this individualistic, classically liberal matrix are much more egalitarian, even in terms than you have in aristocratic or even socialist societies.
To return to Christianity for a moment and its egalitarianism, to what extent do you think that Christianity tends towards a form of feminism?
I think that, in a sense, it necessarily tends to a form of feminism, precisely because there is this idea that you are dealing with the individual soul that is equal, not even if it's unequal in certain earthly terms. To an extent, Christianity necessarily precludes radical feminism, precisely because if you're an Orthodox Christian, you believe women can't be ordained. There are certain functions within the church that it's preferable that women don't hold. So I do believe that to be an honest Christian, that one can only be so feminist, but one is much more likely to be a moderate feminist than what you typically get in, say, pagan societies or in societies that have never been touched by Christianity, or certainly civilizations that have never been touched by Christianity. So there is a momentum for feminism that is present in Christianity. I don't really see feminism as taking on the particular characteristics that it does today if it weren't for Christianity. However, I will say that, like with egalitarianism, the problem with feminism is not necessarily feminism. The problem with feminism is these tribal sociosexual dynamics. The fact that because of evolution or because of the fall, to frame it, that men naturally want to compete for women's attention, that this gives a place of pride to women, that women are kind of like painted in these ennobled positions on, say, the artwork of cavemen and so forth, that you have with somebody like Jordan Peterson, this sort of upholding of women as this sort of embodiment or archetype of Mother Nature. So when you deal with a post-scarcity society, or even a low-scarcity society, and women are no longer dependent on men, that the gender dynamic is going to become quite obnoxious quite quickly. And you even see this in places like Saudi Arabia now, that they're starting to enter into some of this. And that so that even in very patriarchal societies like the Arabic world, you're seeing some beginnings of feminism, precisely because there's not this dependency on men, but at the same time, women still have this sort of place of pride as the objects of that they would have in a patriarchy. So I think that really the seeds of feminism in its most maybe obnoxious manifestations are really inherent in the patriarchy more than Christianity. What Christianity does is it adds a certain egalitarian framework to it, but that's not really the problem. The real problem is that when the patriarchy is confronted with post-scarcity, it turns into feminism almost as a kind of function of nature. You even see that of this in the Bible, where certain decadent societies come to be ruled by women and so forth. And I think the only way of negotiating that is by having some kind of legitimate individualistic egalitarianism that can kind of serve to deconstruct these patriarchal, or if you will, feministic gynocentric arrangements, and I can't really see that happening either without any kind of Christian influence. So I think on net, Christianity is also favorable in this regard.
To what extent do you think libertarianism is that mitigating influence in general within Christianity to steer between the two some of these more extreme impulses? Because I've wondered if, because a lot of Protestants will view the whole period basically from Tertullian to, once Constantine converts, from Constantine's conversion to the Reformation, as a kind of black hole. And a lot of, even libertarians and the Enlightenment people will say roughly the same thing, that things were better under the Roman Empire than they were under the Catholic Church. So I'm coming up with more sub-questions here, but to what extent do you think libertarianism, you could say that the Reformation changed everything. We could also say this was just a reinvention of classical liberal thinking, or maybe just even individualism. To what extent do you think libertarianism currently functions as that role, or could function as that role, or do you view libertarianism this way as a lost cause?
Well, I think that libertarianism is a lost cause, but I think that libertarianism is a kind of subset of a broader phenomenon, which is Western liberal civilization. And in that sense, I think that libertarianism is a kind of theoretical gem in the broader panorama of Western civilized modern man that is in opposition to, as far as is possible, various political correctnesses throughout history, or various manifestations of iconoclastic ugliness. And so I think that this sense of moving, this sort of Whiggish sense of moving towards some kind of civilizational teleology is something of which libertarianism is a very well articulated and valuable byproduct. And so in this sense, I view libertarianism as valuable as a kind of contributing factor to the whole. I don't think that on its own that it will ever exist in its pure form, but it is nevertheless a welcome contributor to my thinking.
You still identify as a Catholic. A lot of some libertarians, some classical liberals as well, historically, would say that being a classically liberal Catholic is a sort of contradiction in terms. There's a sort of anarcho-Catholicism. Now, there's a way you can justify that, and I'm not necessarily saying that as a joke either. I think Lutheranism or historical Calvinism is probably as authoritarian as anything else. Do you think there is any sort of contradiction there regarding Roman Catholicism and libertarianism, or even classical liberalism?
Not really at all, because as far as I can see, there's going to be a seeming contradiction between any religion, any ancient and classical liberalism, because all of those religions predate classical liberalism. So things in Christianity that would seem to historically be at odds with individualism have to kind of be contextualized by pointing out that everything that the pagans were doing was every bit as authoritarian, and as you pointed out, much of what the Protestants did was every bit as authoritarian. So there really isn't the period in which human beings have approximated any kind of liberal society is very small. So there's no reason to really think that anything that might appear to be intrinsically anti-liberal about Catholicism is anything other than just the byproduct of its era. on the other hand, if you really want to know what is intrinsic to Catholicism, it's in the dogmas, that is, in things that have either been declared ex cathedra by the Pope or by an ecumenical council, or certain things that have been so universally taught, like, say, the inadmissibility of abortion, for example, that they are taken to be part of the universal and ordinary magisterium, as it's called. But you'd have to, what I would say to those Catholic objectors is point to what dogma these libertarian detractors are violating, or if you're talking about more of a classical liberal like myself, point to what specific doctrine I am in violation of, and not merely an interpretation of a doctrine. And then we can have a discussion about that, but I've never really seen such detractors articulate their position as such.
Final question, related to Christianity again. What do you see, if anything, the peculiar influence of Christianity on society relative to other ideologies or religions? And related to that, do you think that Christianity is required for what you would consider a flourishing society? You said to some extent it's subjective, but in a society in which you would like to live and you think would be a flourishing one, is Christianity an essential part of that, or is it incidental?
Christianity is an essential factor in a flourishing society, but it's no guarantee, and it's not enough by itself. I think that Christianity has to work in line with those other factors that I mentioned, and even then it's not guaranteed. What I would say is that while it's not a guarantee, Christianity is a precondition if what you want is a society where thinking is socially acceptable as much as is possible, and where one can pursue the truth, and when one can live in a where one is not perpetually in fear of say, being executed for one's views, or for being ostracized beyond that which would be tolerable. In other words, I don't really see a society where the conversation that we're having right now would be socially acceptable, or even tolerable, or even tolerated, if it weren't for some kind of Christian precondition.
That's great. Thank you for your time, R. If anyone would like to follow you on YouTube or anything else you do, where's the best place to find you?
My YouTube is called Right Ruminations, and I contribute content to that regularly on topics such as this, as well as a number of other topics that I think will be of general interest. And I would like to also close by thanking the two of you for inviting me on and for having me to speak with you on your channel. So thank you very much.
And thank you for your time to appear here. If you like this show, please like and subscribe on YouTube, and share it with people that you think might find of interest. And if you'd like to contact us, please email us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.